to have Ms. Mara Leveritt speak to us today. Many of you know her as the investigative reporter who wrote extensively about the West Memphis Three case. She was born in Chicago and grew up in Denver. When she was young, she moved to Arkansas, graduated from UALR, and was a reporter for first the Democrat, then the Gazette, before they merged and became the Democrat Gazette. For some time now, she's been a contributing editor for the Arkansas Times, and she has been writing books on cases such as the West Memphis Three and the Boys on the Track since 1995. So, without further ado, Ms. Mara Leveritt.
Thank you, Lisa, and I want to thank you all. It's very nice, first of all, just to be in a room with a bunch of free thinkers. It is also, I was surprised to realize, a real pleasure to begin preparing remarks for this particular crowd, because although I consider myself very outspoken and I've said more things about myself than most people will admit to, such as my years of smoking pot. But I realized that for any audience, we censor ourselves. And I think part of that is just out of courtesy for the people who might be thrown in to have to listen to us, and part of it's self-defense. And I felt in being invited to this afternoon's talk that reins that I did not even know were on were freed a bit. So I'm going to enjoy this, and I hope you do too. I'm starting off with kind of backing into the discussion that I hope will be a discussion that we'll have, because there's a lot I want to hear about from you, because I'm continuing to write about this West Memphis case. But for starters, I want to go back to last summer, just about this time, when I was invited to go to the little town of Cartersville, Georgia, where they were filming the book Devil's Knot. I have been very closely involved with a woman producer in Hollywood who read the book shortly after it came out, which was in 2002, optioned it for several years, and finally was able to get the millions of dollars needed to put together a film, and got Colin Firth to star as the investigator that I wrote about in the book, and Reese Witherspoon to star as one of the mothers, who barely figures in the book, but turned out to play a very big part by the time the screenplay was written. And I was fortunate enough to be closely involved in the writing of the, not the writing of the screenplay, but the continual readings of the screenplay. And so I'm feeling good about it. And the film is going to premiere in September at the Toronto International Film Festival, and so I'll be going up and seeing it with everybody there for the first time. But this is the beautiful courthouse that was a historic courthouse in this little town of Cartersville that stands in for the not so beautiful courthouse in Jonesboro. It was interesting to me that churches, the street you see there is Church Street in this little town. This is directly across the street from the courthouse, and the street is lined with churches. And considering the role that the churches, or at least belief, played in the story that was being recounted there, I thought it was interesting how so many churches turned out to help with the filming of this movie, Devil's Knot. This particular church was where they had costumes. They had turned over the whole interior of the church was set with all these clothes from 1993 and 1994. And then the church down the street was for the cafeteria to feed everybody. and they had props in another church. The police were equally helpful. It was very nice to see that, and in fact, one of the scenes in the film was filmed inside their police station, and that is set, in my mind, against the position of the police in West Memphis to this day that is pretty hostile to the, any doubt about the guilt of the people that they ended up charging. This was the interior of the courtroom there, quite lovely. Adam Egoyan is the director. He is a Canadian and well respected in the art community, and a fine director. I was glad that he chose to do it. The chairs all were decked out properly, and there was even one for me by the trash bags, you see. Here I am with Pam Echols' mom, who came down. They picked a day when we might be able to kind of not be too much trouble on the set, and so she came down, and that's Jason Baldwin, who I've remained close to since their release. These are, of course, Jason on the left with the young actor who's playing him. The third from the left is playing Damien's lawyer, and in fact, I get mixed up. We'll have to see. There I am with my spouse and partner, Linda, and you all recognize, I'm sure, Colin Firth. This is I'll just go very quickly through these, the actors who play the various people in the movie. The guy who plays Judge Burnett, maybe you recognize some of these faces. Stephen Moyer plays Judge Fogelman, who is the deputy prosecuting attorney, and he, as I found, many of the actors contacted the people that they were playing before the filming started to tell them that they were playing them as a courtesy and to kind of get a feel for them, if only over the phone. And he said that when he called Judge Fogelman, the judge kind of said, so they had to get a vampire to play me. And plays John Mark Dyer. Many of these people were from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, many of the actors. He's the one who plays Terry Hobbs. That's inside the church with the costume room. Methodists inviting Reese and Colin to come to church, and food everywhere. This is Elizabeth Fowler, the producer who optioned it years ago. Everybody was just very, very nice and cordial. There's Reese talking with some of her fans, and this is Reese Witherspoon with Pam Hobbs, who's now gone back to her maiden name, Pam Hicks. That's the character that Reese plays. So that's that. I start there, hoping you'll all go see the movie, but because it's a nice way of backing into how did all of this attention come to be focused on a case of murder and 3 trials in West Memphis, Arkansas. And to talk about that, I have to kind of go back to, will it be okay if I close this? Will it, or,
Cut off projector.
oh, well, I'll just that much, just that much. Okay. So I'm titling my talk in the words of Lewis Carroll, 6 Impossible Things Before Breakfast. You may remember that it was advised that we should all try to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast as an exercise. It loosens up our brain if we're down that particular rabbit hole. I think that the situation at this moment, and at the moment that last summer when this was being filmed, is that since August of 2011, Arkansas has been asked to believe the most impossible thing before breakfast, and that is that the state of Arkansas had the 3 kids who killed the 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis in 1993, had them under lock and key, had them convicted, had 2 of them sentenced to life in prison, had 1 of them sentenced to death, and was just fine with all of that. And then one day, faced with the possibility that a judge might order a new trial for them, suddenly decided, well, we still believe they're guilty. We'd still execute them, Pam Echols, if we get the chance. But we're willing to let them all go on an Alford plea, what was called an Alford plea. Willing to let 3 child killers walk free. Yes, they are convicted mass killers. Yes, they are free, the state tells us. The state washed its hands of the case, and the state spared itself the trouble of having to reinvestigate the case. So all of these conflicting, outrageous beliefs have got to be sort of absorbed by citizens of Arkansas, and it seems we have. I think that there are people who are a little bewildered about it, but I don't think many really are outraged about it. People are generally, if they felt that the guys were innocent, they're glad they're free. If they felt that they were guilty, they think it's a disgusting thing that they're free. But the impossibility of the state's position of trying to reconcile these 2 different claims, if we could have, we would have executed Pam Echols on one day, but we'll let him walk free the next. And basically dump it in the public's lap to make of it what we will. So I'm hoping that, as I told some people at our Parks and Tourism department, I went and I said, you know, you just don't know how bad this is going to get for Arkansas. It's bad already, but it's going to get worse. There have already been 3 HBO films about this. There's been a book before mine, then there's been Devil's Knot. Then the film of Devil's Knot is going to come out, and then I got 2 more books up my sleeve. So it's going to be a rolling train wreck, and it's going to have to ultimately be dealt with. And so far, the position of the state is head in the sand. We just are expecting indifference, I guess, to take care of things here. So, in order to even begin to explain how we got to such an inexplicable position here with the Alford plea, and remember, when are plea deals made? Plea deals are made almost always in lieu of going to court, instead of having a trial. So that's taken care of, there's a deal made, you don't go to trial. To have people in prison, 2 for life without parole and 1 on death row, and then 18 years later come back and say, let's make a deal? It hasn't happened anywhere in the United States, which is why I'm still working on it, because I figure, I sort of feel like I'm the only reporter in Berlin in 1942, or 39 maybe, who's able to be on the ground here and record some really important history that a lot of people are going to be looking back at as time goes on, if only because of all the publicity. But scholars, legal scholars, are going to be looking back on this case for a long, long time, and it's going to be, unfortunately, pretty sad for Arkansas. And the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. Okay, so come back with me now through time to 1993. It's West Memphis, Arkansas, and in fact, we'll go back a little further in the mists of time to the late 80s, when psychologists, by and large, were indulging in a practice of, to simplify it, many of them were putting some of their clients, patients, under hypnosis and coming up with what were called recovered memories. Memories of terrible things that happened to them in their childhoods. And some of them involved people in cloaks, and some of them involved rituals, and some of them involved murders, and some of them involved burials of children in the backyard. And Geraldo Rivera got involved, so you know it was on the level. And, and this became really big. Women's groups grabbed onto it because there was a lot of rape and incest involved in a lot of these recovered memories. And police got involved because, if true, these were crimes. And churches got involved because Satan was involved. So there was a lot of social buy-in to this whole recovered memories and SRA, satanic ritual abuse. In Crittenden County, there was one guy in particular who was a retired airline pilot and now probation officer who took it upon himself to rid Crittenden County of any of this kind of stuff that was going on. And he was on the prowl for pentagrams scrawled on anything. He was looking out for anybody who might have played with a Ouija board last night. He was really into making sure that there was going to be no Satanism among the kids anyway in his county. Well, he had already identified Damien Echols as one weird kid, and Damien Echols at the age of 18 was a weird kid. He had been terribly impoverished as a child. He had been tossed around between a stepfather and mom and another dad and his real dad, but he was bright enough, but he had a bad attitude in school, and he dropped out, and he assumed this persona of arrogance, and by this point he had his fingernails filed to points. He was very noticeable and not very sociable, except he had his best friend Jason Baldwin, who happened to live in the same trailer park, and they hung around together, and they mostly listened to music and did some skateboarding. Jason Baldwin was 2 years younger, 16. He was a good student and had a single mom, parent, but she was a very steady parent, and two younger brothers that he took care of. So, but it was Echols that really disturbed Jerry Driver, this kid, what do you call it, truancy, basically. He was supposed to watch for juveniles. And so then the 3 8-year-old boys, a day in May in 1993, are missing one night, and the next day their bodies are found in a drainage canal just north of the small subdivision where they lived. The bodies were naked. They were bound wrist to ankle behind their backs by shoelaces, their own shoelaces. The bodies had been stuffed into the mud and gunk at the bottom of the ditch, which had maybe 3 to 4 feet of water in it. And their clothes, most of their clothes, were also stuck into the water and held down with sticks. So it was a horrifying discovery when the police ultimately did dislodge the bodies and saw what had happened. One of the boys' genitals were so mutilated that it was assumed immediately that he had been castrated, pretty rough castration. On the night that the boys were reported missing, the evening that they were reported missing, and they were last seen at about 6 p.m., an officer for the West Memphis Police went around to different houses and to the houses of the families that had called in and took the missing persons reports. And then later on that evening, she got a call to go to the Bojangles restaurant on the freeway, which was just, if the houses were here and the freeway going across the I-40 bridge into Memphis, if that's running here, the bodies were found right in between those two places. A Bojangles restaurant along the freeway, the manager called and said, called the police and said, you may be interested to know that there was a man in here. There is a man currently in our ladies' restroom, and he's muddy, he's got blood on him, and we think you should maybe come and check him out. And an officer, this same officer who had just taken the missing persons report, went through the drive-through window and talked to the person at the drive-through and said, is he still in there? And the server said, no, he just took off and headed that way. Whereupon she got a call about somebody's house being egged in another neighborhood, and she left and went to check on that call. So that was never pursued, and the connection was never even made after the bodies were found the next day, that these two boys missing here call that night about bloody, muddy man here might have something to do with the bodies there. But it wasn't lost on the manager of the Bojangles. So after the bodies were found, he expected the police would come. They didn't. So the next day he came and said, we have saved the paper towels, and we've got the sunglasses that he dropped into the women's commode, if you want to come and retrieve those things. So then they did send detectives. Jumping ahead to the trials, when the police were questioned about that evidence, and the defense attorney said, what happened? What was the result of tests on those paper towels, the mud, the blood, the sunglasses? The detective said, well, it was never sent for testing. Why was it never sent for testing? Because it was lost, he said. So then on, every time that the defense attorneys wanted to attack the proficiency of the police, the judge ruled against it and said, the police are not on trial here. These three kids are on trial, and so I'm not going to let you be impugning the police. That wouldn't have worked at the O.J. Simpson trial, but it worked in this one. There were actually two trials. So there was that kind of police work. A month passed, no arrest. You can imagine the panic. People are going nuts. School's out, kids are staying indoors, parents are fit to be tied. Even adults are not going to the grocery store without somebody to accompany them because there was that much fear. So they bring in 17-year-old Jessie Miss Kelly, who was known to them as a kind of a fighter. He was a wrestler. He was a stocky little kid, and he had dropped out of school. He'd been in special ed classes the whole time he'd been in school, but now by the age of 17 he dropped out. And they knew that he had lived in the same trailer park where Damien and Jason had lived. They, by the end, were all living in 3 different trailer parks. But they brought him in and started questioning him. And essentially, over 8 hours of questioning, he changed from saying, I don't know anything about those murders, to saying, yeah, I saw Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin do the murders, and at one point, one of the boys tried to escape, and I caught him and held him for him so that they could finish him off. And of almost between those two times, everything that he said about the murders was wrong. When the police asked him what, and the police only recorded two segments of information, two segments of the hours and hours that he was in there. The first segment, it walked him through what he was saying, and then it is presumed took that out to the prosecutor, who said, go back in and get more and get better, because they came back and said this second portion is being recorded to clarify some of the statements that Jesse said in the first place. And all it did was really muddle it up, because he was even more inconsistent on the second part that was recorded. But these two short parts that were transcribed, he's asked, were the children tied? Yes, they were tied up. What were they tied with? Any kind of time he had an open-ended question, he got it wrong. They were tied up with rope. What color was the rope? Brown. The police knew they were tied up with shoelaces. White shoelaces, black shoelaces. There weren't even any brown shoelaces. He was asked, when did all this happen? He said, well, we went to the woods in the morning, first thing early in the morning. The police knew that the boys were in school that day, that they'd last been seen around 6 p.m. So you hear or read on the transcript the police saying, could it have been later? Could it have been later? And then he gets up to noon, and then, well, could it have been after school? And then, well, was it getting dark, Jesse? Yeah, it was getting dark. He was very compliant, very agreeable, and they get him to the point where he agrees that it was getting dark from being early in the morning. They asked him about if the boys were raped. Yes, they were raped, but the medical examiner could find no evidence of rape. And so there were these and other kinds of serious problems with Jesse's statement. Nevertheless, it was good enough, and I think that the police were desperate enough that they went with it. And the prosecutor, John Fogelman, deputy prosecutor, went with it. And that night they went to Pam Echols' house, and Jason was there that night watching a movie with him, and they were both arrested, taken off into what would be about the next 8 months of being held in isolation while the state prepared its case. So, and Jesse was tried first, because he had made this statement, even though he immediately said, no, that wasn't true, didn't mean it. But they had it on tape, and they were planning to play it, and that was all that they needed for him. And so he goes into, and the other two always have said that they had nothing to do with it. So they go into Jesse's trial, and he says, his defense attorney, who had started off believing he was guilty, but along the way had become to believe that he was not, had called in an expert in what was at the time a kind of a new field of false confessions. We hear pretty much about that now, but at the time people were only beginning to explore the idea, and brought in two people to talk about that, both who had very, very great credentials. But as I recall, both were from California, and that done them in as far as the prosecution was concerned. The prosecutors belittled them and talked about them as being, telling the jury basically, are you going to believe these people, not even from Arkansas? And so it was a real harsh and sharp attack on some of the most respected people in that field, who came at their own expense to talk about this particular case. I interviewed one of the jurors. The jury found Jesse guilty based on his confession, and the Arkansas Supreme Court subsequently affirmed that conviction and noted that the statement was the only actual evidence against him. But I not long ago interviewed the jury foreman, and who is a very nice man who worked as in a factory in northeast Arkansas, and he felt very certain of his position with what they knew at the time. There's nothing grandiose about him, but his statement was, I could believe that someone would lie about kissing a girl that you hadn't really kissed if you wanted to make yourself look good. But I can't believe anybody would lie about killing kids or helping kill kids. So with that kind of thinking and the very able work of the prosecutors, he was sentenced to life plus 40 years. There was a big problem going into the second trial, Jason and Damien. There was no apparent motive, no indication that the three had ever even encountered the three victims before, and no murder weapon. There was very little, and in fact, in perhaps the most stunning aspect of this case, it was reported in a very short piece in the New York Times just after the three teenagers were arrested. And a producer, Sheila Nevins at HBO, saw this little article and called up two really fine documentary filmmakers, Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, who had already done a lot of good work, and said, take a look at this. You might want to go down to Arkansas and see what this is about. And the idea was, you got three teenagers killing three 8-year-old boys. Find out why. What would make those kids do that? That was what they came expecting. And they insinuated themselves into the community, and they worked really hard to get the permissions that they needed to film this. It's not easy. Can anybody think of another trial in Arkansas that's ever been filmed? No, we don't even get our local TV crews into most trials. You had to get the approval of all the prosecutors and the judge and all the defense attorneys and the defendants and their parents, because they were minors, and except for Damien at that point, and the victims' families. That was a lot of approvals that they had to get, and they spread some money around to do that. They would not say that they bought those permissions, but they did, out of compassion. They said these were poor people, at least the ones who weren't associated with the court were poor, and they did give some money. So, and they got it. That Arkansas allows it under those conditions. I'm now a very strong advocate, as those of you who were at the Clinton School, where are you? There you were when Jason Baldwin came here, and we talked about every trial should be open. Every trial should be open to the kind of technology that Mark is using right here. We can do it. There is a test case situation in Massachusetts right now where they call it open court, allowing technology to allow it to happen. And we know that these programs are very popular where they are allowed. The best arguments I've heard against it from judges here is that they are afraid that the lawyers will not do their duties properly because they'll be hamming it up for the cameras. That's, to me, not an argument. The lawyers do your duty, and the judge, if they're not, fine them in contempt if they're not doing it. But make this important part of our democracy accessible. So they're going into the second trial now, and the prosecutors, the HBO, had covered the first trial, and now it recorded it beginning to end, and now was getting ready to go into was filming the prosecutors having a talk with the parents of the victims, and they're saying, we don't know about this one. We give it a 50-50 chance. We don't have this, we don't have that, we just don't have very much, and they're not pleading guilty, and so we don't know exactly what we're going to do. Now, mind you, that didn't stop him from asking for the death penalty for all three of them. All three of these had been charged with capital murder. So 50-50 chance, not that sure. And the prosecutor, Fogelman, had, from the minute of the arrests, been so uncertain of the police work and the evidence that he issued prosecutor's subpoenas. Not often done. Usually prosecutors rest on, by and large, on the work done by police. But in his case, he interviewed dozens, if not over 100 people himself through prosecutor's subpoenas, trying to get something to hang his hat on for that second trial. And it was really going to be dicey. Let me see, the murders were in May. The arrests were almost a month to the day later in June. The first trial, Jesse's trial, was in February of '94. In October of '93, the prosecutor Fogelman got an idea, he told me in the later interview, which was that Jason Baldwin, now everybody knew Damien was weird and had these spiky fingernails and walked around wearing a black cloak even on hot days and or trench coat and not a cloak, but so he had the weirdness factor going, but Jason was kind of like a really good guy as far as anybody could see. So, but he lived next to a lake, and remember, we didn't have any murder weapon yet, but we think that there was this castration going on. So the prosecutor, Fogelman, had Arkansas State Police divers come up there and go out and dive in front of, near the trailer where Jason's house was. And within 10 minutes, lo and behold, up pops a diver holding in profile a serrated knife, which is what the medical examiner had said had inflicted the wounds on the genital area of this one victim. And when I interviewed then Judge Fogelman a few years later for my book, I asked him, well, did you ever worry about that somebody might have known you were going to do that and planted that knife? And he said, oh, no, we told no one what we were up to. But shortly after that, I went and I was going through the West Memphis Evening Times before the building burned down, and there was, on the front page, was a photograph of the diver still dripping, just come up with this, holding the knife. And it was clearly serrated. And found out later on that a Memphis TV crew was there for that, to capture that moment as well. So far from not telling anyone, they had alerted the media as though maybe somebody knew what they were going to find. And something was found, this knife. Problem was that there was nothing other than that it happened to be in the lake, happened to be near where Jason lived, happened to look like what the medical examiner said had been used on the kids, but there was no real chain of evidence, no fingerprints, no nothing that could absolutely say that that had anything to do with the murders. So they got into the second trial. Things were, the prosecutors apparently felt not looking strong enough for their case, even with the introduction of this knife and a map showing how close it was to Jason's house and so forth, and the introduction of 16 black t-shirts that they had taken out of Jason's home. Well, I see a lot of black in here today too. That's not looking good. Yeah, they took out 16 black t-shirts as evidence, and they took out books from Damien's house by Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Dean Koontz, who he liked to read, and a book that he'd bought from a library used book sale called Once Upon a Time on a Broomstick, because he was interested in magic. He still is. But he, so all those things were introduced as evidence, and when asked by the prosecutor, a detective was asked, the same one who mentioned that Bojangles evidence had been lost. When he was asked, why did you take that evidence from this house, the Damien's house, those books, he said because he thought that literature that kind was strange. And that was good enough. The prosecutor left it at that. So, still very concerned about their position, I think. They had a conference with the judge. The judge said, you are not required to introduce evidence of motive, but essentially, in my reading of the transcript, he almost says, but it would probably be a good idea if you gave it a try. And the prosecutors then called a Dr. Dale Griffiths to the stand, Griffis, who had a degree in the occult. And as one of my friends who teaches at Bowen School of the Law said, that's sort of like being a Ghostbuster. What kind of a degree is that exactly? And where do you get it, more importantly? And it turned out he'd gotten it from one of those little ads at the back of comic books that you can send off and get a PhD, and the defense was on top of it. The prosecution dropped the ball, and Fogelman admitted he was humiliated by how they had failed to check out their witness on this one. But they'd found a guy who, by God, had a degree in the occult, and they grabbed him. And the defense established that he had gotten this by sending in a coupon and paying the money. And when asked, had he ever gone to any classes, the answer was no. He had never attended a class at all for this PhD in the occult. And so, but he was really crucial to the case, for the prosecution's case, the state's case. And Judge David Burnett said the defense moved to have him not be allowed to testify as an expert, and the judge said, I don't think there's any minimum qualifications to be an expert witness in Arkansas. I don't think you even had to get out of third grade. And God bless HBO has that on film. And so he was qualified as an expert witness, and then proceeded to tell everybody that yes, in bloody deed, this was an occult ritual slaying. These 3 boys were killed as part of an occult ritual because why? Because there was the full moon that night, and because there were 3 victims. We all know 3 is a mystical number. And because there was blood at the scene and water. Sacramental icons. And put that together with the 16 black t-shirts and the long fingernails, and you pretty much had the case. And of course Dean Koontz and Stephen King. So he was allowed to testify. He said that he had seen teenagers who were involved in the occult, and indeed they did wear black a lot, and some of them painted their fingernails black, and some even had tattoos. So there you are. Now remember, it's Jonesboro in 1994, and we're talking about 3 dead children. So there was a lot on that, a lot hanging on that jury. So the motive was established. These were satanic ritual killings, even though by that point, in 1992, the FBI had already conducted a survey as a result of all of this satanic ritual abuse, recovered memories thing. The FBI had assigned one of its agents to survey every known case or claim of SRA. And they had not been able to find one body in one backyard or verify any of the claims. And so, and that paper was written and produced by the FBI in '92. Apparently, none of the defense knew anything about that because it was never cited at the trials. So what you had was trial as theater, I believe. In front of the courtroom in both trials were the two bikes. The three boys were last seen riding on two bikes, two obviously on one of them. And those bikes with the clothes and the bodies had also been submerged in the drainage canal. And so no one contested that those bikes, the boys were last seen on them. They weren't at issue at all. But they sat in the front of the courtroom for effect the whole time. So nobody could forget that the size and the age of these victims. And then climactically, at the end of the second trial against Damien and Jason, Judge John Fogelman, then the deputy prosecutor, took the knife that had been found in the lake and picked up a grapefruit and standing in front of the jury box, made whack, whack, made some whacks into the grapefruit and said, "See the pattern here? It's just like the pattern that we found on the body of the one badly mutilated boy." Well, there'd been absolutely nothing to show that grapefruits and human flesh mark up the same, or, there'd been nothing to establish the relationship of those things, or even, in fact, that this pattern matched that pattern. And in fact, there seems to be a question about a transparency that seems to have been missing from the state crime lab that tried to do that. That transparency, as far as I know, has been mentioned in a memo and never been seen again. So, based on an entirely circumstantial case, and I've pretty much told you the circumstances, the jury found Damien guilty and sentenced him to death because he was considered the ringleader, the brains behind this outfit, and Jason Baldwin to life in prison. Jason was 16 when he entered the Department of Correction for murdering 3 children. Of course, their case went to the Arkansas Supreme Court for review, all their cases, and it took 80 pages for the Arkansas Supreme Court to explain how it found nothing wrong whatsoever with Pam Echols, Jason Baldwin's, or Jesse Miskelly's trials. Nothing whatsoever. But the HBO film came out, and that's when the most amazing thing happened. That's when people like you said, wait a minute. Nobody in Arkansas said, wait a minute, about this case, except Jesse Miskelly's lawyer, Dan Stidham. He was hollering it, but other than that, and the Arkansas Times was too. Other than that, certainly not in our official, in our court system. Nobody was saying, wait a minute. But individual people, a group of folks out in Los Angeles, and all of them working somewhere or another with the film industry, called, and they thought by the time the HBO film came out in 1996 that surely those guys had been out of prison. They took the time to call Arkansas and found out that the Supreme Court had affirmed all their convictions. No, they were never getting out. And then they started a website, 96. Things were just beginning to pop on the internet. And from that, a ball started rolling. A few years later, there was enough interest as HBO continued to air this, and that a young man in Denmark started an archive called, he was a fan of Dirty Harry movies, and he named his site Callahan 8K, and he, never dreaming that it was going to turn into the biggest archive of a single legal case that exists on the internet anywhere, I believe. But he started then, with the help of other people who would provide documents, putting every single thing in a completely objective, just an archive, just records. He's got media in there, articles that I wrote and other people, the Memphis paper wrote and so forth, but the police documents and the court documents are all there. And anybody wants to go read it, go see what really happened. Go see it for yourself. And I'm really glad that he and Jason and I are now collaborating on the book that I'm now writing about what came after these guys got out. But so lots of people got involved, and then musicians. I'm sorry to say that writers, not so much. I hoped that some of the writers I've already mentioned, whose names were brought up at the trial, might have stepped forward and said something, but they didn't. But musicians, Metallica lent its music to the HBO films right off the bat, right from the very first one when approached. And then a lot of West Coast musicians got involved, particularly Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. And then he started getting some lawyers on the West Coast involved that he knew. And it took years and years and millions and millions and millions of dollars. But they got lawyered up for some really hard-hitting appeals. And I'll tell you, our Attorney General's office didn't know what hit them, did not know what hit them. And when we say that we've got a system that corrects itself, we don't. We've got a system that defends itself. The Attorney General fought. We passed a law in Arkansas in 2000, I believe, to allow anybody who felt that they were convicted and there was DNA evidence that had since been discovered or that was there at the time, but the ability to test it was not available. If anybody in prison wanted to give it a try and take their chances that it might confirm their guilt and had the resources, which are not inconsiderable, to have it tested, they could. We had that law. And when these three guys, with the help of attorneys being funded by mostly musicians and actors by this point, tried to do that, the state took it to the Arkansas Supreme Court to fight and oppose letting that happen. Prior to that, the judge had stalled and stalled, even releasing the material for new analysis. And then they got to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and there was a battle in front of the court in oral arguments, which are really, they're online, and it's quite something to watch. And pretty much the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General who argued was drubbed in those arguments. And the Supreme Court said, no, the law is what it is. And they get this right to have these things tested. And so by this point, the technology had changed enough that by 2007, and there was enough money. Now Peter Jackson, the Lord of the Rings films, and so he and his wife Fran had gotten very interested in Pam Echols' case, and Damien's wife Lori was really beating the bushes with a lot of these high-profile people to raise money. And when the Jacksons, who had a lot of it, got involved, it was time to untie those knots, those shoelace knots that were put around the boys' ankles and wrists. They'd never been untied before. And when they were untied and examined, inside one of those knots was found a hair, which was identified as belonging to, and with all the probabilities that go with DNA, belonging to the stepfather of one of the boys. And a hair that had never been found, or that had never been examined before for DNA, that had been found in the bark of a tree near where the bodies were discovered, was also examined, and it belonged to the man who was with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather, on the night of the murders. They kind of were each other's alibis. And neither of them was saying that they were down there at the creek that night. So there was intense interest focused on them. It was intensified even more, I'll add, when there was a demonstration at the state capitol building and Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks spoke, and she mentioned this, that this had happened, and that this hair that appears to have been from Terry Hobbs was found at the site, and need to pay attention to all this before they were let out. And Terry Hobbs sued her for slander, and that wasn't a good thing to do because she had more money than he did. He got a good lawyer, but she got really good lawyers. And Terry Hobbs was deposed, and he said, I didn't see those kids at all that night. Whereupon, once that was reported, three women who lived just down the street from him said, when they read that, they said, wait a minute. No, we saw he was talking to him that night. So things have kind of spiraled in a bad direction for him. All this to say that when the case got to the Arkansas Supreme Court and the Attorney General, well, in fact, Dustin McDaniel, before it got to the Supreme Court, had told a crowd, we don't need this DNA law in Arkansas, and we surely don't need the court to interpret it in these guys' favor. And the reason is that we do not execute innocent people in Arkansas. Take my word for it, I guess. That was just supposed to be it. But the cutting part of that is that if we are supposed to believe that this is a system that really wants to check on itself and really wants to make sure that justice is done, and that we've got an appellate system that's going to try and make sure that it is and fix things if they're wrong, that's not how it works. That is not how it works. The Attorney General's office, in my experience with this and another current case, is that it views its job as almost as a corporate attorney, one who is saying that the state of Arkansas has hired me to defend whatever position it's got, and I do that. And the American Bar Association says that for prosecutors, that is not the rule. The rule for prosecutors is you have a different rule than someone who's just representing a client. Yes, you are representing a client, but you are representing the interests of the citizens of the state who have the interest in justice. But our Attorney General's office now, and I think in recent history, has not gone that way. So we have all of that. I think it leads to a tremendous lack of faith in the courts. And with that, I will like to invite you all to give me a break here and tell me, why is it? I put in the notes that I would be speaking today about authority, and I've certainly been speaking about the exercise of authority, how the courts have exercised their authority in this case, disgracefully in my opinion, and ridiculously, and shamefully, and embarrassingly. Tell me why. What is it about authority that we seem, or correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're so meek. I think we bend to it so easily. I'd like to hear your opinions.
All right, so ask the question again.
Why has there not been a howl from within Arkansas? All of the pressure on this case has come from without. From California. New Zealand, for some reason, is nuts about this case. Australia, all of the English-speaking world, Canada, the other states, many other states in the United States care a lot about this case. Why is Arkansas not up in arms?
Not that I have any opinions. Why are you laughing? I see a couple of different problems. One is that the law about prosecutorial misconduct has absolutely no teeth. There are no consequences for any prosecutor who commits any kind of prosecutorial misconduct. They can run roughshod over the system, and the worst that will happen is somebody will get off. They are not personally affected by it. That, in one instance, is why things like this happen. If we ever read or heard of any case, and in fact, I'm not aware of it nationwide, not just in Arkansas, but nationwide. I'm not aware of any prosecutor ever being prosecuted himself for abusing his office. And this case in particular, and I mean, you and I have talked about this case plenty, so you know I feel pretty strongly about it. This is one of the most egregious cases, not only of prosecutorial misconduct, but of judicial misconduct that's gone unpunished.
And you're an attorney, so what's the bar doing?
The bar's not doing anything.
And why is that?
I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that. I don't know if it's a case of circling the wagons and protecting our own, but Dan Stidham is a hero as far as I'm concerned. And this case started, I'll give you guys a little background because I know I haven't talked to everybody in this room about it. This murder happened a week after I opened my first solo law practice. I was a clerk at the Supreme Court. Prior to that, I worked for Judge David Newbern, and I thought that the court did everything it could. I was so proud of the work I had done there. And I watched this case unfold with horror because, I mean, I was an atheist back then, and I saw this for what it was. It was a witch hunt. And I was horrified. I didn't think I could do anything about it, though. I was just this kid fresh out of law school who didn't have any experience. And I have always regretted that I didn't reach out to Dan at that point. At the same time, when the decision came down, and I had read the trial transcript, I knew one of the lawyers who was handling the Echols-Baldwin appeal, and I had read the entire transcript. And I was horrified, first of all, that they were convicted. But then when the Supreme Court affirmed it in that absurd opinion and did absolute logical gymnastics in order to reach the conclusion they did.
In fact, they quoted Dr. Dale Griffiths, the cult expert.
The cult expert, please. It was a travesty. It was an absolute travesty. And the thing is, I talked about it with so many other people who said, yep, it's a travesty. And everybody just kind of went on with their lives. Maybe because we aren't personally affected or we don't know the people who are personally affected. And it may be like Damien Echols has said so many times, who were they? They were just white trash. They didn't matter. They were, whose? Newbern's mistake? I never talked to him about it because I mean, that was, yeah, but he wasn't. He wasn't. Nope, he wasn't.
They were unanimous opinions.
He wasn't, and I was personally devastated and felt betrayed by that because I was ashamed of that decision, and I was ashamed of what, I mean, law clerks always refer to my judge. I was ashamed of what my judge had done in that case, even though I didn't work for him anymore. I was really ashamed. And I probably ought to let somebody else have the mic.
Yeah, there's someone in the back.
I'm going to stand up so y'all can hear me because I know that you might not be able to. I don't know that they needed to hear me say all that, Mark. What I was going to say is I lived in West Memphis during this time, and I actually worked with with Miss Kelly's mother in a nursing home when I lived there. And what I would say about it is there were people in West Memphis that wanted to say something about it and do something about it, but they were so profoundly poor and in such, it's just, you can't even imagine it. We see it here in Little Rock, but it's really bad. They're just so profoundly poor and uneducated. And I was telling somebody just this last week that a lot of them were victims of their own upbringing. You talk about, you hear the term country bumpkin. There really are people that are so uneducated that they don't know what to say or how to react. And then what you said about that they were innocent, they knew they were innocent. Damien Echols got up there and acted so arrogant in some of the trials because he knew that he was innocent, And he just never dreamed that they would find him guilty. I mean, it never even crossed his mind that he would be found guilty. So he behaved that way, and it played against him because the jury saw him acting like that, acting nonchalant, like he didn't really care, and scribbling notes and drawing pictures during the trial and all that stuff. So the other part I was going to say is I lived in West Memphis during that time. I listened to the same music he did. I read the same books he did. I have a tattoo. I'm so glad nobody ever mentioned my name. So that's really, that's scary how that you can just, because of the music and the books, and that you can just, and you have a tattoo, that all of a sudden you're a suspect in a murder where you didn't even know the children.
What
So,
color was your trench coat?
yeah, and I had a trench coat. No, I didn't have a trench coat. But anyway, that's just what I
That's very
wanted.
interesting. That's interesting. And Damien told me when he was in prison, he was applying logic to this case. He was thinking, there can be no evidence because there can't be any evidence. And he was smug, as you said, very smug about it.
I would suggest that the reason why there was so much mobilization or activity from other countries, like Canada, Denmark, and such, is because they're so opposed to the death penalty, and they find that Americans in general are just, it's absolutely horrific that we are, killing people and imprisoning so many people. We have so many people in prison compared to any other industrialized country. So I'm just kind of throwing that out
That
there.
they would be more predisposed to be shocked. Is it?
Right. And
Culturally.
Thank you.
Yes,
I appreciate your.
thank you. Okay. Yep.
I don't have any inside knowledge about the case, but Beale Street Music Festival was going on that weekend, and I was staying about 200 yards from where the bodies were found. So I was there and saw the yellow tape around, and didn't know what had happened until the next day. I was still there, so I was interested, and I followed it all along. I've seen all the films. I've seen the West Memphis Three twice when the free screenings earlier. Saw Scott Ellison and the other attorneys that spoke at the State House Convention Center right after the offered plea was read, was agreed on. And why we default to authority, I don't know. I think that seems to be more the status quo, is default to authority. And of course it didn't help, I think, because the defendants were poor white trash. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's Arkansas is small. Maybe everyone thought, everyone knows everyone. Maybe they thought the prosecutors in the case were good people and they wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't true. You got me. I've questioned authority all my life. Sometimes it's gotten me into trouble. But it's not just Arkansas. Texas has executed at least one person that everybody agrees was innocent. The case, the guy who was convicted of arson, his children burned up in a fire, he was executed. And nowadays, the science of arson has pretty much proven it was an accidental fire. There was no arson involved in that fire. And it's pretty much, I can't recall, I don't remember the case, but I've read some of the transcripts and all in that case. And Florida was just trying to streamline their execution process. And NPR had a story on this, and something like 1 in 3 people there had been, I don't recall the numbers, but an amazing amount of people had been proven innocent with DNA and stuff that would have been executed if the prosecution had gotten their wishes, and they're wanting to speed up execution despite that track record. Texas, Florida, Arkansas, but I think it's.
Well, let me throw this in then, just to be inflammatory. We're talking about this region, our region here. What is it about our region? I often think that it is it may have something to do with the fundamentalist religions that are so dominant here. And I welcome any other thoughts on that. Yeah, wait, there was somebody else over here waiting, I thought. Yes, you. Mm-hmm.
I like that you asked a really focused, detailed question. What is it about Arkansas? Nobody here was really standing up for these people, but people from the coasts, from Canada, from Australia, New Zealand, were getting really passionate about it. And why was that? And that made me think, well, what makes those populations different than the population of Arkansas? And given my background, it made me think of a couple of personality traits that have been well established, have decades of research about them: right-wing authoritarianism and tolerance for ambiguity. And those two personality traits are very closely correlated. If you're high in right-wing authoritarianism, you're probably low in tolerance for ambiguity. I say probably, statistically speaking. And if you're low in right-wing ambiguity, you might have a higher ambiguity for tolerance. And so, or tolerance for ambiguity, I'm sorry, got that backwards. And tolerance for ambiguity means, do we have to have an answer right now? Are we sure? How aversive is the state of being unsure about something? And so when it comes to what we expect of our leaders and what we expect of our attorneys and our court system, if you're high in right-wing authoritarianism, you can't accept the answer of, we just can't find the person who did this. That's not acceptable. Somebody has to be found. And from a leader's perspective, from the Attorney General's office or from the police department, those people have to provide those answers, or else they will not be perceived as leaders anymore, because they haven't provided those answers, and somebody, then their role will be challenged. Just my thoughts.
May I ask you, is this a field that you're in?
Used to be about 2 careers ago.
Well, is there some reference work that you could suggest for me on this topic?
Hundreds of academic articles that have probably been condensed into a lot of books that I can't think of, but look for academic research on the construct of right-wing authoritarianism and tolerance for ambiguity.
Will do. Thank you. Okay, and
I've always thought that the connection was fairly clear, just because fundamentalist Protestants are typically very intolerant of other religions. This is one of the things that makes fundamentalism, I think. And in this case, we have the most outrageous difference in religion that these boys could have possibly had, by being at least perceived as Satanists. And as you say, there was an anti-Satanist mania going on here in particularly the late 80s in this country, and so it's not a surprise that this would be the place in the country that you could see an action like that. I also noticed that the prosecutors missed an obvious bet in the trial when they used the grapefruit and showed that kind of knife had the same marks as on flesh. And since the boys were Satanists, they obviously had magical powers and could have turned flesh into grapefruit. And the proof that they did it was that when they were all done, they turned it back into flesh so that nobody would notice.
And it wasn't just there was the claim of Satanism. It was sort of just dropped here and there. But Damien, when asked on the stand, said he identified himself as a pagan, which is practically the same thing, I guess.
By that time, the public perception of them as Satanists was pretty solid, though.
Yes. Yes.
The news media and everything.
And there was not any effort being made to distinguish
that.
among different sets of beliefs like that either.
I'm going to jump back in here on the legal system itself and what it has to contribute to this problem. And that is, I think we've got a distinct lack of critically thinking fact finders. Those are the juries that are the ones who actually find these people guilty. We have a largely uneducated population. Anybody with an education is going to have a way to get out of jury duty, because who wants to leave their job to go do jury duty? We've got 3 people in this room today, I think, who are on jury duty right now. Not, of course, that they can constitutionally take Arkansas's oath to be a juror, but that's beside the point. But a lack of education coupled with conservative ideals. Now, by definition, the more conservative someone is, the less open they are to new ideas, or to ideas that are alien to them. Doesn't even have to be a new idea. If it's new in their spectrum of experience, they're going to be resistant to it. And education coupled with progressive ideals make people more open to alternatives. They also make people more skeptical and more likely to be engaged in critical thinking. One of the refrains that this organization sings constantly is the dire need for critical thinking skills introduced into our education system at an elementary level. Don't wait till college, which is the first place most people in Arkansas are introduced to critical thinking. It's a standard freshman course in, I think, every public university in this state, because no one knows how to do it until they get to college. And that's a travesty.
And so, are you doing anything about trying to get those skills taught in schools? And do you run into people who say, no, we can't do that in elementary school? Pardon me, was there an answer there? No, okay. Okay, were you good?
Just following up a little bit on what Robert was mentioning, this kind of thing is frighteningly common to me. I mean, prosecutorial and police misconduct is kind of a thing I follow. It's a mild obsession of mine, and I can't go a single day without seeing something. Something the police did wrong, something prosecutors did wrong. Radley Balco writes for Huffington Post now. He has his own blog. He's a great source for...
Who?
Radley Balco, B-A-L-K-O. He covers this kind of thing a lot. There was a case...
I know him. Yeah,
I was reading about a case last week where a man called 911 and reported he was being robbed at gunpoint. And the police showed up, killed the suspect, who was not armed, as it turns out. And they shot him while he was running away from the police. And so, of course, the person who called 911 was found guilty of manslaughter. The police were just doing their jobs.
So what do you all, I mean, this is a small congregation. I kind of stump around and talk as much as I can about these issues. I think getting the trials recorded and available so everybody can see what happens to any trial that anybody wants to tune into. And I think that would put everybody more on their toes and have a much more informed jury pool, for one thing, if an educated jury pool. And we could be doing all kinds of things to educate and teach critical thinking. So I'll drive the question again. Why not? And I know you stood up before I asked that, but...
Well, it kind of goes along with that. I think one thing, and that sign keeps coming up there, beware of dogma. I think sometimes some of the attorneys and prosecutors get caught up in their own dogma. They can't admit that they're wrong. They made a mistake. They can't admit it. Even when it was reviewed by the Supreme Court in Arkansas, they could not. There's some kind of good buddy boy system here that I've seen, that they can't admit that even somebody else in their same field maybe made a mistake. Why not have an open mind? Why not say, well, maybe there was a mistake made. Let's relook at this. And saved 3 people from being, one of them being executed, other 2 spending their life in prison. They can't do that. And we kind of ran into the same thing, not on the same level, when we as a group tried to put up a winter solstice display at the state capitol. We ran into all kinds of roadblocks because people were thinking the same way they'd always thought and couldn't think outside the box or use rational thinking. But one thing that you said that, and I wrote it down because this really does kind of incite me, but I really don't have any young children that are out in the community, and I don't have any grandchildren. But either way, with what the men accepted as pleas, either way, we now have murderers out in the street. There are still someone out in the street that murdered those 3 little boys, whether it's the 3 that took the plea bargain, whether you think they're guilty or not. If they're not guilty, whoever did it's still out there, and if they are guilty, they're out there. So I'm with you. Why aren't people with children, especially in West Memphis, even though they are poor and maybe don't have the resources, why aren't people incited by that there's murderers out in the street? And then I said that about admitting, that you're wrong. When you make a mistake, I think they just can't admit that they're wrong. And I've seen that probably through the whole system, through their whole trial, that nobody could admit, maybe we made a mistake. And like the Bojangles man, I heard about that. I knew, because I lived there. I knew that they had seen a bloody man in the Bojangles that night. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, so why, either way, we've got murderers out on the street.
Well, and in fact, I didn't mention that 2 of the parents, or the parents of 2 of the victims have now come around and said they don't believe that the West Memphis Three are the ones who killed them. And they want the state of Arkansas to order a new investigation and try and see who really did it. But the state is in this situation of just kind of washing its hands of the whole thing, and glad that Damien's gone to Salem, Massachusetts, where he now lives, and Jason's up in Oregon, and Jesse, God love him, is in Marion, Arkansas, but he's not being harassed, so that's good. Yeah.
In reference to your inquiry about educating our kids and therefore maybe starting to have some critical thinking amongst our general population. I know a lot of public school teachers, and they're having to teach to standardized tests on a regular basis. And I mean, this is not news. Everyone's heard about this probably, but it's apparently very difficult to spend the time to teach this sort of abstract type of critical thinking. They feel hard pressed to even cover the material to keep up with these national testing, so we need some sort of reform in education that is less black and white and more ambiguous, I guess.
Be neat as an extracurricular thing in schools if they offered something like that. I taught my kids with I did homeschooling, so I taught my kids with these red handwritten books. You would do logical thinking exercises. Mostly I did it because I thought they were fun myself. Not all my kids didn't always think they were fun, but it can be done, and it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's tons of different extracurricular things that we have with kids. That would be one of the suggestions. I'm not in this field, so I
Well, I'm not either, but that doesn't keep me from spouting. but it made me think that even a 1-week summer free thinking camp, how much fun would that be? My word. Yeah.
Well, I think we all have probably encountered a problem with critical thinking when we always ask our parents why, and they say, "Why do you keep saying that?" And don't keep asking me why, just do it. One of the things I'd like to ask you about is you referred to the prosecutor's methodology, I guess you would call it, where typically with a corporation, their job is to, protect the corporation. And in a prosecutor's, would it be the Attorney General or the In government, when the attorney's objective is not to protect, is to uphold justice, basically. And how do you, and exactly what is that, the difference between the two, and how do you expect I mean, to me, it seems like a corporate attorney is really cut and dry. You know, you do everything you can to protect this corporation, or you do everything you can to protect this client. Now, what is the difference, and how can that be instilled in the? I mean, I assume that is that's the rule for the government attorneys.
It's up to their interpretation, and the Bar Association, as I said, the American Bar Association has said that both prosecutors at the circuit court level, their job is not the same as make sure that this guy gets convicted, because that's what the state wants, and the other guy, that the prosecutor at the trial level has got a higher interest, they say, and that is to make sure that to represent justice. That if something comes up that is going to fly in the face of a just outcome, I mean, basically, if I can get away with winning, even though I have information that I know something that would indicate he's really innocent, or someone else is actually guilty, I should not allow that to happen any more than the judge should allow a conviction under those circumstances. It's not a football game, but it's played like a football game. But the Attorney General in particular seems to have this corporate mindset. And I think that this is one of those things that's just going to have to come from the bottom up. These are political people. We haven't mentioned politics yet, I don't think, today. But let's look at this whole case as politics. 3 kids are killed, and nothing happens for a month. You've got police and mayors, and someone did mention that the authorities who are under a lot of pressure to resolve the situation, and so they do by an easy grab. And it is easy, because these kids don't have means at all to defend themselves, or families of means. So they, but what happened was that through that fluke of HBO getting involved, and enough people being outside of our little realm here, taking an interest in the implausibility of it, then money comes in, and then the state has met its match, really has met its match, to the point that it has to come up with this ridiculous conclusion. But what was interesting to me, did anyone here happen to be at the concert where Eddie Vedder and a bunch of folks, great night, came to Robinson Auditorium in 2010, fall of 2010, October, September, and put on a heck of a great concert. Tickets were $10 or something like that. 4,000, it was to benefit the West Memphis Three. 4,000 people in Little Rock came out for a benefit concert. Now, you could say that they came to hear Eddie Vedder. You could say that, well, that was a cheap way to get to see some big stars for a night. But it was a benefit for 3 child killers. And I think that night sent a message that turned this case around, because, not saying that it was a direct factor, but it was a month later that the Supreme Court said, we're going to send this case back, take another look for a new trial. And so that swelling, once 4,000 people in Little Rock turned out to basically say, we got our doubts about this case, that's where I think the message got sent. And it took some big names and good entertainment and everything else to do it. But the idea that judges and courts are so pristine and so insulated. They weren't insulated in the beginning. There were mobs outside the courthouse there, and I don't think if I'd been a juror at one of those trials and had been the lone juror holdout saying, but there's no evidence, but there's no evidence. No, we got to acquit, there's no evidence. And then walk out and go to Piggly Wiggly or whatever and be that person and want to carry on life after the media that had been put out about it, it would have been hard. It would have been very, very hard. So there is, I think, to acknowledge the politics is both daunting but empowering, because we can see, I think this case clearly shows that politics, the winds of money and politics turned it around, period. Period. They'd still be in prison if it weren't for media money and politics. That's all there is to it. And money being the biggest factor. As Peter Jackson said, what's the price of justice in Arkansas? About $10 million. And that's humiliating. It's humiliating. So, okay.
I think that politics is dead on in this because we have an elected judiciary and we have an elected prosecutor. David Burnett, for example, was on that case for 17 of the 18 years that it was on appeal. He was the trial judge in both trials, and he was so obviously biased against these guys, it wasn't even funny. I think there were maybe 2 rulings at trial that went in the favor of the defense, and one of those was to sever the cases so that the prosecution would have an easier time to try Damien and Jason. And the other one, I think, I'm going to draw a blank on what it was now. It was the suppression of the confession in Damien and Jason's cases, which, through juror misconduct, got in front of that jury anyway. And nobody wanted to do anything about it. It was brought to the judge's attention, and he said, oh well. And that's because he wanted to stay elected. We've got prosecutors who know that if their conviction rates are low, they're not going to be reelected. So politics plays, it's more than just public opinion. It's actually what happens with each politician and how he's going to keep his job. One of the things that really struck me at the oral arguments on the DNA appeal was that the crux of the Attorney General's argument in that case was, if you allow DNA testing in this case and in any other case, despite what the statute says, the finality of judgments is in jeopardy. Because, oh my God, if people start suddenly reopening cases because they were wrongfully convicted, we're going to be setting a bunch of convicted people free. Of course, they may be innocent convicted people, but that's going to clog up our courts, and we don't want that. We would rather have guilty people stay in prison than set innocent people free. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, you've been very helpful to me in helping frame some thoughts that I have had and adding to them. And I know you've been sitting for a long time.
My name is Stellas. I know Anne for, I think, maybe more than couple of years. We meet in Socrates Cafe. The first time I met, I asked Anne, why is that we don't have in the schools a curriculum for critical thinking? And she said, no one knows how to teach, or some such thing she told me. So as a free thinkers club, the word what I think the club is associated, I would say, why don't we have a summer session? You know, most of the children get out during the summer. As a club, we can organize, bring in some experts in critical thinking from, if it is not available in Arkansas, bring from other states and have a seminar, or especially for young kids, or even for the adults, or even for the politicians, for example, or judges. And maybe conduct some test publicly so that they'll be ashamed. At least they will start at least thinking towards getting those kind of education. Just a comment.
Well, I remember when I asked my mom why, she would say, "That's a very good question, and you remember it, so when you're dead, you can ask God." But then I bet, as with probably many of you anyway, you kind of reach that moment when you think, wow, it's kind of cool out here where you can think things for yourself and don't have to be constrained like that. And I think a summer camp or something like that would be great fun for a kid, for many kids anyway, to be able to come and be challenged to think in new ways and experience that. Yeah?
Everyone knows about Camp Quest, right?
I don't.
Camp Quest is a camp where they emphasize critical thinking and scientific discoveries, experiments, and they have the closest one to us is in Oklahoma. What city in Oklahoma? What town? Does anybody remember? But you can find it on Google Camp Quest and find more information if you guys are interested. But yeah, it would be nice to have something like that a little more locally, a day camp or something. Eight and up, like 8 to 18. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Well, how about this? Why don't we stop, and everybody who wants to go on and do something else with Sunday, go for it, and I'll hang around, and anybody who wants to hang around, we can do away with the podium, and I can just sit down and talk with you. How's that? Be good? Okay, thank you.